Record. Okay, it's going now.
Okay.
Very good. Okay, well, thanks, Michelle. Welcome, everyone. And we have a great uh, presentation, two great speakers. Uh, Jeff Welgan, the Chief Strategist and CEO from skillrex, and Will Morrow, founder and CEO of FourOne Insights. And the topic is new research, case studies, and data-driven guidance for cybersecurity talent optimization. And this is really timely when we talk about all the emerging fields like AI and cybersecurity and quantum computing and how it's poised to reshape our economy. We were just in an Insight Community Connect event last on Wednesday night, and the students were taught that we met with and the employers were the students were saying, I have a very hard time getting a job. And some of them are going back and taking two or three more certs, taking two or three associate's degrees, and still not getting a job. So let's hear this data. Welcome, Jeff and Will, and I'll let you take it over.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Stephen and Michelle. It's great to be here and really excited to share with everybody some of the research that we've been doing on the cybersecurity workforce at FourOne Insights. For those of you who don't know me, I've been analyzing the cybersecurity workforce for about 13 years now. Previously was with a company called Lightcast and also helped oversee the development of a tool called cyberseek.org. But about a year or so ago, decided that having a consistent paycheck was boring and decided to scratch the entrepreneurial itch and founded FourOne Insights, which is a research and advisory firm that really focuses on the impact of emerging technologies and trends on the workforce. And so we provide a lot of analytics and advisory support and research that really tries to unpack what are some of the key trends occurring across really the workforce more broadly, but certainly within the cybersecurity workforce as well. And so today, what I'm going to do is share some research from the work that we've been doing lately to really try to unpack what are some of the key trends happening across the workforce. How do those then distill into what's happening in the cybersecurity workforce specifically? And what are some of the actions that can be taken to try and help address what some of those trends imply for various stakeholders? So I will go ahead and pull up my slides. So let me know if you are able to see them.
Yes, I see them.
All right, perfect.
Thank
So, really, what I want to do today is primarily drive this conversation off of a couple of recent research reports that we've put out, as well as some other accompanying research that looks at some of the broad trends that we're tracking across the entirety of the workforce, as well as in cybersecurity specifically. And so, the first of these reports that I'm going to be pulling from is from a report we released earlier this year that we called the Talent Turning Point. And in this report, we specifically dove into four key trends that we're seeing shaping the future of the workforce, both in cybersecurity and beyond. And so I'm going to start by just talking through what those trends are and then sharing some data about how they're playing out within the cybersecurity workforce specifically. So the first trend I want to talk about is what we call the vanishing career ladder. And the idea here is that there are fewer and fewer opportunities for entry-level workers to enter into different types of fields, especially the fields that traditionally were open to somebody who had a bachelor's degree or higher. You've heard a lot of people talk about this issue lately. We're not the first ones to call attention to it. But the issue here is that entry-level opportunities, that first rung on the career ladder, it's very inconsistent right now for a lot of folks. And we're seeing that in the data as well. I think it'll be interesting to track this over time because, yes, over the past few years, we have seen a rapid decline in the opportunities for early career workers. But actually, over the past year, we started to see an uptick in demand for certain entry level opportunities that a lot of people thought, hey, we thought those were going away. Now, the flip side of this, however, is that we're starting to see a bifurcation between early career opportunities for somebody who has a bachelor's degree versus somebody who doesn't. And across almost all of the traditional BA plus fields or the fields that could be BA or sub BA, we actually see that demand is starting to tick up for early career workers who have a bachelor's, but it continues to decline for people who don't. And so I think this will be an important trend track across the workforce to make sure that we're not creating greater inequality in the workforce as a result of differing access to opportunities. Now, in cyber, this is really nothing new. For the 13 years that I've been tracking the cybersecurity workforce, I've almost never seen much movement in terms of the level of opportunities for early career workers or workers who don't have a bachelor's degree. So cybersecurity was cutting out that entry level rung of opportunity well before it was cool across the economy. And right now, what we see is that it's still only somewhere around 15% of cybersecurity job openings are saying that they're open to somebody who either doesn't have a bachelor's degree or has fewer than at least 3 to 5 years of prior work experience. And this is effectively constraining the talent pipeline. And it's created what looks to be like a surplus at the entry level cybersecurity workforce, whereas the rest of the cybersecurity workforce, it appears as though we still have a gap. And so this is going to exacerbate that gap for a long time to come if we don't change it. In fact, when we actually look at the data, we see that if we compare the supply and demand for cybersecurity workers, we actually do see that it appears to be a surplus at the entry level. And this is problematic because almost all of the interventions that we have seen in the cybersecurity workforce have really focused on trying to expand opportunities for people to get degrees in the field. And people, they listened. And that's a good thing. But it's not a good thing if employers aren't adapting how they hire for cybersecurity workers. And we have fewer entry level opportunities that allow somebody to actually get a foothold within the field. And that exacerbates the talent shortages at later stages of the talent pipeline, as we're certainly seeing in the data. So I think this is going to be a big challenge for the cybersecurity ecosystem to try to overcome, is figuring out how to solve that chicken and egg problem of trying to get people experience when employers are only hiring for people who already have that experience. The second trend that we highlight in this research is what we call the AI turning point. Can't talk about the future of work right now without talking about AI. But really, what we're starting to see is that organizations are trying to get more intentional about how they integrate AI into their organizations and how they really operationalize this. And as a result of this, we're seeing that a lot of firms, they're starting to move beyond the tinkering phase, and they're starting to figure out how AI can be diffused across different corners of their organization in the most effective and efficient manner. And as a result, we're now seeing new skill requirements for AI related capabilities spread across really the entirety of the workforce, at least anybody who uses a digital tool. And the majority of jobs now that call for AI related skill sets are outside of traditional tech roles, which is a complete 180 from where we were just a few years ago. And this is potentially a reskilling issue for a lot of organizations as well as individuals who now have to learn how to utilize these new capabilities. But it's also in the security context potentially problematic because you have more people utilizing this new tool that not everybody knows the best practices around, certainly from a security standpoint, as well as any other standpoint for that matter. So I think this will have a number of ramifications across the workforce, but also within cybersecurity specifically, we are seeing that AI is driving a lot of change as well. Not just related to AI, but if we look across all skill requirements over just the past 2 years, almost a quarter of the key skills required in cybersecurity have shifted. And when we look at what skills are actually driving that change, many of them are related to AI. If we look at the fastest growing skills in cybersecurity over the past couple of years, most of the fastest growing at least have some tangential relationship, if not a direct relationship, to AI, including generative AI, AI more broadly, as well as machine learning and other capabilities that are increasingly expanding in importance within the field because AI is growing so rapidly. And this presents a strong challenge in the field to keep up to date with the latest and greatest skills. People are going to have to constantly reinvent their skills. They're going to have to utilize this new tool, and it's moving so fast that you're really aiming for a moving target if you're trying to remain up to date within the field. It's also reshaping a number of different workflows. We actually see that across all of the traditional tasks that an information security analyst was performing, somewhere between 17 to 26% of those tasks and the traditional workload for an InfoSec analyst are now either being automated or augmented by generative AI. Now, on the one hand, you might say, well, that means that at least a quarter of the cybersecurity analyst's work is still going to be performed by a human, so we're probably not going to be automating them out of existence anytime soon. So that's a reason to breathe easy. But on the other hand, that is a staggering rate of adoption for a technology that's only a few years into its infancy. And I'm not an AI doomer. I don't think that we're going to see mass unemployment anytime soon just because of AI. But I do think that, and this is going to continue to compound that reskilling challenge that we see across the field. So the third trend I'll highlight is what we call the top-heavy organization. And the idea here is that we are seeing managers increasingly take up larger shares of employment across organizations and across the economy more generally. And this, in fact, we saw that the managerial job category grew faster than any other job category across the entirety of the workforce. This is also leading more employers to ask their managers to take on more skills and become executors as well as overseers. If you have fewer opportunities for people who actually do the work and you're only hiring the people who oversee it, eventually you still have to figure out, well, who's going to do that work? And as a result, we're seeing that the skill requirements are and responsibilities are increasing dramatically in some managerial positions. In fact, in computer and information systems managers, they had the largest number of new skills added to their traditional portfolio. I think it was around 20 or so that we saw were added as common skill requirements in just the past few years. And that is going to be difficult for many managers who are both trying to oversee operations and they're trying to actually execute now because organizations have shifted where they're hiring to more advanced positions. This is also something that we're seeing happen a lot within the cybersecurity workforce, and we're seeing a dramatic increase in the number of shares that, or excuse me, the share of skills that are increasingly being required at more advanced positions within the field. Some of the roles within cybersecurity that have seen the most skill growth and the most new skills that they have to incorporate into their portfolio. These include cybersecurity managers, even CISOs, and other more advanced workers within the field. I think in some ways, this is largely a reflection of what we were seeing with the vanishing career ladder as well as AI. So this is a bit of a consequence of those trends as well, that because we don't have as many entry-level opportunities, and because we have all these new technologies and new skills that we have to incorporate into our workforce, the higher level workers, the more advanced workers who are still remaining on payroll, they're the ones who are increasingly having to work more and do more. And I think there's a threat that that's actually going to lead to worse outcomes as a result because people are going to be stretched thin. This also means that in addition to thinking about reskilling everybody else who's got to learn new skills, we also need to think about how are we reskilling and future-proofing our managers as well. We saw a few years ago when we looked at some research that nearly 80% of cybersecurity managers actually don't have any prior managerial experience before they got their current managerial job. And then on average, it was around 11 years since they had last been in an education or training setting. This means that we have all these managers who A, haven't had experience managing, and B, haven't had an opportunity to update their skills in a traditional training setting for over a decade, which means that we probably have a lot of people overseeing teams who need to upgrade their skill sets alongside their team members as well. So I think this is often the forgotten piece of the reskilling puzzle, that we also have to focus on how do we ensure that our managers are remaining up to date with their capabilities as well. The last trend I'll mention from this research is what we call the talent ROI reckoning. And the idea here is that we have seen for a long time, organizations didn't really think about their talent supply chains with as much rigor as they did their physical supply chains. And as more organizations over the past few years have been asked to tighten their belts as a result of rising interest rates, AI, other factors, whatever it may be, we now find that companies are having to be far more intentional about how they think about optimizing their workforce investments. And we see this in the data. There's been a big jump in demand for workers who are focusing on strategic workforce planning. And I think cybersecurity is actually a fantastic place for this to be applied. Because if I'm optimistic about it, this more intentional approach to workforce planning in the field could help to solve some of the long-term talent pipeline challenges that we've been talking about for well over a decade. It's also a great way for companies themselves, frankly, save a lot of money. We find that organizations that take a more strategic approach to how they think about building out their cybersecurity workforce and upskilling their workers, they see significant ROI as a result. When we look at some of the highest growth skills, for example, in the market, if you're an employer, you're going out and just trying to hire for those high growth, high value skills, you're not going to have a lot of people, and that's going to drive up salaries. And in some cases, we can see the salary premium might be even as high as $30,000 or more just to add one skill to a job that you're trying to fill. Well, guess what? It doesn't take $30,000 to train somebody up in one skill. So if you're an employer and you're able to isolate those high growth, undersupplied, and really expensive skills, and rather than trying to hire somebody who has a bunch of years of experience and is going to cost a lot of money to bring them on, if you find somebody who maybe has less years of experience or has some of the skills necessary, not all of them, and then invest in training them once they enter in the door, that's how you can really maximize the ROI of your reskilling dollar. And so I think that this is a great opportunity for people to take a more strategic approach and frankly save a lot of money while also helping people advance within the field. Similarly, we find that organizations, when they take a more strategic approach in cybersecurity, they can also dramatically improve a lot of their hiring outcomes. And sometimes they only need to do that by something as simple as right sizing what they're asking for. If, for example, you remove that bachelor's requirement that we've historically looked for, or you reduce the number of years of experience, we find that on average can save well over $10,000, sometimes over $15,000 or more per hire, and you can dramatically expand your entry-level candidate pool. Similarly, if you remove some of the skills or certifications that are really nice to haves, but not need to haves, but are going to drive up hiring cost and difficulty, then on average, we also see that organizations can often save $10,000 or more per hire. If you're a large company that's hiring a lot of cybersecurity workers, that cost savings adds up very quickly. And so I think that this is a great opportunity for more companies to really take a more strategic lens on how they're investing in their cybersecurity talent pipelines. So this, of course, raises a question of, well, if there is a lot of potential opportunity, both for individuals as well as companies who are taking a more strategic approach to thinking about their cyber workforce, how do you actually do that? What are some of the best practices that organizations should be adopting in order to maximize the ROI of their talent investments and boost the broader resilience of the cybersecurity talent pipeline? And we really wanted to try and provide quantifiable evidence on that question. And that was the motivation behind the second report that I'll talk about, which we released a couple of months ago with WESIS, Women in Cybersecurity, who partnered with us to produce this research called the ROI of Resilience. And the point of this research was to answer that question of what are the highest impact talent practices that organizations can be leveraging that are both good for expanding opportunity in cybersecurity and boosting the resilience of the cyber talent pipeline, while also benefiting companies and their bottom lines. And what we found from this research is that skills-based, talent-friendly practices consistently generate significant returns for employers while also benefiting individuals. So what do we mean by skills-based and talent-friendly practices? Well, to make this more concrete, these are things like offering a mentorship program that helps people advance. These could be things like providing more personalized training pathways that are aligned with the emerging skills that are most needed within different roles, or it could even just be using skills data more generally to help support your workforce planning, because that is often correlated with stronger employment outcomes and better outcomes for individuals as well, who are given opportunities and a roadmap for growth. So we found that when organizations were implementing these practices thoughtfully, the highest impact practices on average could help organizations save over $127,000 over the course of the average cybersecurity worker's lifetime by virtue of reduced hiring costs and decreased attrition and increased productivity. So there is real benefit to employers But there's also a lot of benefit to individuals who resoundingly in this research also told us they love these practices and they would love it if their employers offered them as well. So I think these are some of the ultimate win-win opportunities for companies to invest in their people in a way that's also going to benefit the bottom line as well as the individuals themselves. Problem is, although everybody said they love these practices and they're high value, adoption is really uneven. And a lot of employers are not effectively utilizing these practices right now, if they are at all. In fact, we found that the highest value practices were only being utilized by about half of the employers we surveyed, which was actually among the fewest employers leveraging some of the practices we saw. So, highest value practices were the least likely to actually be utilized. This
Mm.
tells us that more organizations should be adopting these practices for the benefit of everybody. We also found that when they were adopting these practices, though it's not on the slide here, they were often utilizing less than ideal data. They were often relying, for example, on managerial assessments of the skills that their people had. And when you have subjective data trying to describe the skills of your workforce, you're not going to get the high impact outcomes that you could be if you had more objective skills information on your workforce. So all of this tells us that employers, they have a little ways to go before they adopt all of these high value practices as effectively as they could. But the silver lining in this is that if these are super high value practices that not a whole lot of people are adopting, well, then if you're an employer, that's how you can really differentiate yourself and improve your employee value proposition and your employer brand and just have better talent and workforce outcomes more generally. We, as part of this research, created this talent practice prioritization matrix that really just helps you isolate what are the practices that you as an employer could be adopting that are both underutilized and highest value, because those are the practices you want to prioritize because they will help you differentiate your employer value proposition and wring as much value out of your workforce as possible. And at the same time, it's going to be good for workers and the broader resilience of our cyber talent pipeline. Um, we also recommended as part of this that organizations really be thoughtful about how you continuously optimize the way you're thinking about your talent strategy. I think that many companies have taken a very reactive approach in the past to building out their cyber workforce as well as their workforce more generally. And we're finding that in today's reality, you can't do that. Both because we've had a longstanding talent pipeline challenge in the field, but also because regardless of what you say about AI, I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. We have declining birth rates and aging population. We have increasing death rates. We have declining immigration rates, declining labor force participation rates. All these demographic factors are just going to make it harder and harder to find talent over time. And AI has a long way to go before it can really take over a large swath of the workforce, especially in a field that is so compliance heavy and risk averse as cybersecurity. So I think that companies are really going to have to figure out how to continuously adapt their talent practices so that they can expand their talent pipeline and really boost the ROI of their talent investments. And ideally, we'll do that in a way that also benefits as many people entering in the field as possible so that we're able to boost the resilience of both our talent pipeline and our digital infrastructure while providing more access to opportunity for more people. So I will pause here. I'm happy to take questions either now or later. I'm also happy to always talk more about this and share more information about our research. I can talk data for days, so reach out anytime. But with that, I will pause and hand it back over to Stephen and Jeff, I believe.
Okay. We'll get questions after Jeff makes his presentation. Is that okay?
Yeah, I think that's a good plan.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Okay, Jeff.
Well, fantastic. We'll get started here on our side. Everyone can see this screen okay?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Great. Well, thank you. And Will, awesome presentation, by the way. I think it's a good segue into some of the data we'll be providing from skillrex side, also taking a look at some of the data from the WESIS association as well. So just by way of context setting, a little bit about skillrex. At our core, we provide the intelligence layer for the cyber workforce. If you look at the modern SOC, we have sensors for every packet moving across the network and every process running on the endpoint. But when it comes to the people operating those systems, most leaders are really still flying blind, relying on those outdated resumes and those gut feelings. So we changed that by treating workforce data like security telemetry. We ingest several disparate data feeds. Think of these as workforce sensors. We've certainly used FourOne Insights as an external market sensor in some of our analytics as well. Can't say enough great things about FourOne. But these sensors really include everything from hands-on performance assessments to internal HR data, certification records, performance records, et cetera. So we take that noise, we synthesize that into what we call human firewall telemetry. Then we provide that in a dashboard, but really it's more than a dashboard. We're giving leaders actionable intelligence. So this shows you exactly how your team's actual skills align with your specific job requirements. And then by quantifying those capabilities, we allow you to move from guessing about your talent to measuring and mitigating talent risk with the same precision that you'd use for your technical infrastructure. As we dive into the data today, I want to clarify the roadmap that I'm going to be talking about. So we'll be looking at two distinct pieces of research. The second half of the session will focus on the WESIS performance study, kind of dovetailing into some of the research that FourOne also did with WESIS. But we're going to start here with the skillrex aggregate research on enterprise competency expectations. So this is not labor market data. I think Will's got the insight into that. But what we're providing on the table here is the demand side of the equation from what we see with our clients and other associations that we're working with on what they're actually asking for when they're building out their cyber teams. Specifically, we're going to look at the data surrounding power skills in this first part of the research. And this research isn't based on what practitioners think they need. It's really based on diagnostic data from those enterprises across multiple sectors. So it reveals the true delta between technical requirements and the professional maturity required to protect a modern business. So let's get into it here. Most organizations believe their biggest risk is a lack of technical talent. But the data that we see tells a different story. And we see that the real risk is a visibility gap. So on a resume, we can see certifications and the technical history, which we call the floor. But we often are flying completely blind to the human performance that actually stops a breach or makes a difference in a job role. We are oftentimes, and I say we as the collective community of employers here, are hiring on a baseline, but failing based on the ceiling, with the ceiling being those power skills. So when we aggregate the skillrex data across all functional groups for cybersecurity, things like GRC or defensive security operations, offensive, AppSec dev, there's a bunch of them. We see that power skills aren't just a nice to have, they are the performance ceiling. Our enterprise diagnostics show that professional capability expectations, or those power skill expectations, sit at 53.9 on a scale there out of 100, while technical requirements hover significantly lower at 38. The market or our enterprises are clearly demanding more than just technical proficiency when they're looking at what's important across skills for cybersecurity related job roles. When we look at this is the same data as the previous slide, by the way. So I failed to kind of mention that this graph here is a job role expectation visualization and profile, looking at any given role. We're looking at aggregate data here. So we're taking all job roles and outlining the proficiency expectations across competencies, across technical competencies here in the blue, and then what we call power skills competencies on the right-hand side in the yellow, purple, and green, which represent leadership, organizational, and professional skills. So when we take this data from this slide and break it down to what are the top 15 in-demand competencies across all levels, across all work roles related to cyber, the dominance of human performance is really undeniable here. 11 out of the top 15 demanded competencies across the industry are those power skills, again, represented by green, purple, and then yellow, but there's no yellow in the aggregate view, which is leadership. This tells us two things. First, that these aren't niche requirements for managers. They are essential for every role. And second, these skills are highly transferable. So whether you're a SOC analyst or a pen tester or a GRC lead, these power skills are core competencies that allow you to move and thrive across an entire cyber landscape. Within those top 15, we see what we call the core trio of resilience. These are primary drivers of enterprise survival, essentially. And that's emotional intelligence, critical thinking, and communication. So the fact that the power skills occupy nearly 75% of the top demanded list proves that the market is no longer just looking for cogs in a technical machine. They're looking for resilient, adaptable professionals. So technical skills, again, will get you the job, but power skills, especially this core trio here, are what make you indispensable and transferable across the entire organization. If we look at the trajectory of a career in this industry, looking across junior, mid, and senior here, it becomes clear that seniority is not just a measure of years in a seat, it's rather a measure of human complexity. The junior floor definitely proves this even at the entry level. So at the entry level, the expectation for emotional intelligence, which is at 36 out of that 100 scale, is already higher than the requirement for technical data security at 32 or almost 33. This tells us that being coachable and having the baseline for professional maturity, being able to read people and work alongside people is actually the first requirement for the job. You don't get through the door on technical merit alone. Obviously, it helps, but it's not the only thing that's important. But let's take a look at what happens as we move up the growth curve here. While technical skills like access controls or data security are vital, they tend to level off in the 60s as the practitioner matures. In contrast, power skills like communication, strategic relationship management, and critical thinking, they continue to climb. To reach a senior leadership role, a practitioner faces a nearly 100% growth curve in those areas. So the expectation for emotional intelligence more than doubles, jumping from 36 at a junior level to 75 or almost 76 at the senior level. At the top of the pyramid, you aren't just managing machines, you are managing people, policy, and risk. And I think that's kind of reinforcing some of the data that Will just covered too around the managerial expectations. The danger, however, is that is what we call the technical fixer trap, which is we often promote our best technical performers into these roles where their primary assets are no longer security tools, scripts, or infrastructure, but instead other humans become their main interaction tool or asset. So if we don't measure the maturity of these power skills during that promotion cycle, we're essentially flying blind into leadership failure. Expertise without emotional intelligence creates bottlenecks because, as many of you probably have experienced in your own careers, a senior person who doesn't have that personal touch and understanding of human behavior and interaction is likely to fail in the long run. So I want to give a quick action plan related to the power skills piece. So the data really here is only useful if it changes how you lead on Monday morning. We've seen enterprises that are starving for power skills. So here's our roadmap for closing that gap and moving the team into, or I should say, from a technical floor into a performance ceiling. First and foremost, we need to fix our visibility. We have to recognize that while certifications are great for validating the skills floor, only performance data starts to reveal that ceiling. So a certification shows that a candidate can pass a test. However, workforce intelligence starts to shed light and validate on whether or not they can execute when the pressure is starting to mount in whatever role that they're sitting in. So we need to stop hiring for the test and start hiring for the execution. And that's a mindset and a cultural change for organizations. Second, we have to change how we approach learning. Think for a moment about any skill that maybe anybody listening to this today has truly mastered, something you really excel at today. So I would venture to say you probably mastered it by doing it repeatedly and refining your approach through trial, error, and feedback. So power skills, because it's really hard to teach power skills, right? Power skills are really no different than that, a learning approach. They aren't necessarily taught, they're forged in those high pressure loops. And we must prioritize those work-based learning and apprenticeships that allow those practitioners to build that interpersonal muscle through any real world friction. Third, we need to rethink our architecture. It's time to ditch those generic job descriptions, start rethinking that to Will's point earlier as well, and how you can get some good ROI by reevaluating that. And start thinking about the functional groups, what those functional groups of cybersecurity, whether it's GRC or defensive, et cetera, what do they actually do? Rather than just being boxes on your org chart, you need to really start to identify your T-shaped operators, the people who have the technical depth, right, that vertical line, but also can bridge the gap to explain business risk, which is that horizontal line of the T. And then finally, look for AI synergy. Use AI to clear the technical grunt work and all the data noise, right? If machines are handling the what, then our humans then can become free to focus on the so what. As AI scales tasks and helps with efficiency and speed, only human leadership can scale strategy and resilience around that adoption. So that's really important. Okay, so we've explored the enterprise demand for power skills. It's time to look at who's actually meeting that need. We're going to shift and move now into some preliminary executive findings from our 2026 WESIS Cyber Talent Study. This is a landmark research that's a direct collaboration between WESIS and skillrex. We've been doing research for them for the last couple of years on what their talent looks like and performance. So it's really designed to move beyond the anecdotal evidence and provide clear data-driven picture of talent performance across our industry. Going to again reflect back on Will's presentation about utilizing strategies and workforce intelligence in your strategy. That's exactly what WESIS is doing with skillrex, so they can get a clear picture on how do they promote talent and try to define what talent needs are going to shape those members and have them excel in the industries they serve. So if we look at the data behind what we call the WESIS Edge, we've compared 532 WESIS members across a very, very large comparison of industry cohort practitioners. Our WESIS group is really diverse. It had over 50% at the junior level, reflecting incredible success with WESIS programs for career changers and college students who are coming into the career. We also have strong representation across mid and senior levels as well. When we looked at the 60 individual competencies, and you saw a picture of that earlier, a clear pattern started to emerge with WESIS. WESIS members don't just keep up, they show up in exceptional strength, especially in areas around critical thinking, emotional intelligence and interpersonal skills, and risk management. And on the technical side, they are leaning in cloud security and identity management. So while we see development opportunities in infrastructure design, the core power skills that we talked about just a minute ago are clearly part of WESIS DNA. On the junior and mid side, the most striking finding is that what we call the junior performance edge of WESIS, meaning to what degree is WESIS members outperforming peers, is they're outperforming their peers by 21%. Which is massive. So this is a very material difference in workforce readiness for WESIS members compared to others in the industry at the same level. And it tells us that women entering the field through this ecosystem are significantly better prepared than the average practitioner. At mid-career level, the edge remains strong at 14%, but we're seeing a really fascinating shift. Women in that career stage are excelling in active defense competencies such as threat analysis and incident management. However, we also see potential elements of a structural barrier there with that group. Mid-career WESIS members trail non-member peers in contracting, procurement, and business acumen. So this is interesting because it suggests that they are doing heavy lifting in their day-to-day roles, but they are often, and this is reinforced with other research that WESIS has done, but they're often systematically excluded from the commercial strategy and budget discussions of the department. By the time we reach senior and managerial level, the performance edge compresses down to about 7 or 8%, which is still a very healthy edge, I might add. We attribute this to industry survivor bias. Essentially, by the time non-WESIS professionals, those industry peers, reach the senior level, they have acquired enough on-the-job experience to close that performance edge gap. But there's also a warning sign here with the deficit in strategic planning. At the senior level, the strategic planning at the senior level compounds the business acumen gap that we saw at the mid-career level. It confirms what WESIS leadership has long suspected, that a lack of visible female role models in executive positions and a systemic exclusion from board-facing elements of security. So the WESIS edge is real, as the data shows us here, but to maintain it at the senior level, we have to create more pathways for women to move from the server room and into those boardroom experiences. And we're going to pivot real quick into the most discussed frontier, of course, as AI. To measure AI readiness, we didn't just look for a single skill. We analyzed a cluster of 14 competencies, ranging from the technical building blocks like data security to professional skills like law and ethics. The standout regarding WESIS here is that what we call the analytical advantage. WESIS members hold a 15.41 performance edge in critical thinking, which in the world of AI is the ultimate, in my opinion, the ultimate power competency. It's the human gatekeeper required to spot those AI hallucinations, to verify automated logic, and lead the high-level reasoning needed for AI red teaming. AI can generate data, right? But it takes this human edge to evaluate its logic. That's why we often will say the human in the loop of AI. It's really important to kind of have that in there. This is paired with a 12% performance edge in specialized AI security. Our WESIS cohort here was significantly more prepared than industry average to defend against specific threats like prompt injection and model extraction. But readiness requires technical foundation as well, right? WESIS members show a clear edge in the building blocks of AI systems: database administration, computer languages, and threat analysis. Also, I should add that regulations like the EU AI Act, as those come more and more online, and if we see adoption here in the US of regulations around AI, leads in law, policy, and ethics, risk management, those are really going to be really important too, as those position the community to lead on the governance side of any kind of tech or tech implementation. Excuse me. But we also see two areas here for alignment from the WESIS cohort. The industry benchmark leads in mathematical reasoning and enterprise architecture. So this tells us that while WESIS members are masters of AI application and security, there's an opportunity to lean further into pure mathematical foundations and large-scale systems design. Just a QR code if anyone wants to check out the preliminary findings. We are still in the process of evaluating it at more depth for an entire study. Some of the next steps that we're going to take with this study is a breakdown by those functional areas: defensive security operations, offensive security operations, etc. We'll be looking at cohorts. So one of the things that we do with WESIS is evaluate academic programming that they're partnering with. So if they put a cohort of WESIS members through some sort of academic program and training, we measure at the beginning, measure at the end, taking that performance data to see how effective those training solutions are for them. We're providing more insights for individuals there, and then we're providing this dynamic operating picture across for WESIS members across the year, right, to see kind of how those shifts in skills change across time. So kind of wrap this up here. We've looked at the enterprise demand for those power skills and tangible performance advantage demonstrated by WESIS members, especially in the high stakes world of AI. So I'm going to try to bring it together here. This next section is really about moving from analysis to implementation, and giving some actions to turn these insights into concrete workforce strategy that you can start to execute against immediately. So we'll conclude by I'd like to remind everyone that data is really only a strategic asset if it leads to action. To close that visibility gap and build a resilient workforce, everyone has a role to play. So here are some additional action items for Monday morning. For cybersecurity leaders, the burden and clarity really rest on you. You must align your talent strategy with your actual business goals annually, and you have to reevaluate those business goals annually too. You need to stop looking at boxes on those org charts and start creating a strategic team map based on the skills required to hit your program milestones. For HR business partners, they're essentially the architects in this game. You need to utilize the skills and role data to refine job architecture. We see this all the time in a mismatch of job titles to what actually is being required for the roles. So don't let your cybersecurity team fly solo, 'cause they're usually doing it. You need to collaborate with them to define and map those roles that reflect the modern multidimensional reality that exists right now in the cybersecurity profession. For hiring managers, accuracy is really your best recruiting tool. Ditch the generic job descriptions, move to skills-based assessments for interviews and execution, not just test-taking abilities. Once they're in the door, once your candidate's in the door, you need to prioritize professional development as a core management function, not an afterthought. And for individuals, practitioners, here, the choice is yours. You should seek out employers who prioritize skills-focused development. In an industry moving as fast as ours, lifelong learning is the only way to ensure your career advancement stays ahead of that curve. And my overall call to action is for the group today is really simple. To conduct a deep dive analysis of your team's current competencies against your actual role expectations. Find the right strategic partners to help you secure that intelligence layer and guide you on a sensible data-driven roadmap. And that's all I think I have for today. So I just want to say thank you for everyone for giving them time. Always happy to connect with anybody as well. You can check out our research, but also just any questions or needs, you can just reach out to me directly. I'd be happy to answer them there as well.
Does look
Good.
like, thank you so much, both of you, for your presentation and all the data and information to help with decision making. Before we, it looks like we may have at least one question in chat before we get there. I had a question regarding some of the gaps you identified with respect to employers using that strategic approach and the gap, of it, training programs. So, or how they're actually training, and maybe with a reason why they're not doing that. So does any of your data or research kind of identify how many have in-house training programs, use outsourced training programs, or what it looks like to me is maybe don't have one at all? Because I see that as a potential opportunity for partnership with many of our member institutions in closing that gap, whether it's through a degree approach, to upskill that worker into an executive role, or just getting us, the skill set they need, that work-based skill set they need. And so on that tailoring program side. So that's my question for you both.
I can go jump in first. For us, so when we work with enterprise organizations, their learning programs is one of the sensors we want to ingest. So we will work with them on whoever their training providers are, whether that's an internal training program or a vendor like SANS or Immersive Lab, whatever they may be. We want access to the learning management system and the performance data because we'll baseline people against on their performance. We'll identify what the expectations are so we can identify critical skill gaps. Then we catalog essentially those training vendors and providers, what their courses are, map that back to our taxonomy so we can make recommendations on what tools and courses they have available within their training ecosystem that's going to have the greatest return on investment. So we reduce time for those practitioners spent in training by focusing on the things that matter most. And then we also reduce capital investment by really focusing on what matters most for the business. So that's all part of our telemetry. And we bring that in on a quarterly basis so we can watch skills gains across those gaps in near real time for the workforce.
Will,
Are
did you
those
have any?
partner?
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. Look, I just wondered if those were like Fortune 500 companies that you're mainly working with. You talked about enterprise, power skills. So when I think enterprise, I'm thinking more of these large corporations. They're going to have their own training centers for the most part.
Yeah, a lot of our clients are Fortune 500 clients because they have a large enough workforce where they've realized I need a strategy and I need a strategy that's based on real data. That's not to say we don't work with smaller organizations as well, but obviously with a larger workforce, they have a bigger risk profile by, being off by X degrees left or right of whatever the risk tolerance may be for skills.
And then, Will, did you have anything to add to my question as far as what the picture looks like from in-house training versus outsourced training. And if there's a specific category you're tracking for academic, partnerships with academia.
It's a great question. So the short answer is I don't have hard data to say who's using in-house versus partnering with academia. I can say, a couple of things though, based off of what I've seen. One is that in general, learning and development budgets have been going down recent years. I think that's more a function of what's happening at a macroeconomic level. I do think though that it'll have some long-term consequences for companies who start to lose some of the muscle memory around how to build out the new capabilities in their workforce, and how to invest in training. I think that's an opportunity for more training institutions to come in and help fill that gap, as fewer companies are investing huge amounts of dollars in their in-house training programs. I think that's where you can look to outsource, and that's where training providers should look to help fill that gap. I also think that when I look across the companies who are large enough to have investments in training, right? If you're a two-person mom and pop shop, you're probably not going to be spending a ton on training, although you still need to reskill. But the larger companies, I would say they fall into a few different buckets. One is, hopefully there aren't many falling into this bucket. They just don't think about training. But I'm sure there are some out there. But the other buckets are, one, they might be building out in-house training resources, which that there are pros and cons to all of these, right? That one is useful because then you can form fit it to what you need. You have ownership over your talent pipeline. I think there's a lot of value in that if you know that you're going to recoup that investment over the years, and it's a sustainable need. There are also institutions or organizations who just invest in some external training pool that is scalable, but may or may not be form fitted to what they're looking for. I think that, I'm not going to name any names, and they have their place as well. There are a lot of training providers out there who, they have good content, but they're really intended to help you reach scale quickly with your training. And that can be useful if it's, something relatively simple, but I think it's not as great when you really need to go into depth in a subject. And so the third route is where they partner with external training providers, either to build something that's form fitted for them, or they utilize something that's pretty close. And I think that's a good hybrid approach for a lot of organizations. And so I think that's where I would love to see more collaboration between training providers and employers, to help scale up that model, because I suspect it's going to be more cost effective for most companies. And I think that's going to be a real appeal in the current funding climate for L&D.
Yeah, I'm seeing that as an opportunity, especially at the community college technical skills workforce development area, because those institutions like to keep those costs low for the students. And so to the extent employers would partner with them on tailoring their needs, I think that's a great opportunity anyway see, I think there's some other questions.
There was a couple, few
Do you want to
questions.
grab those, and I'll go ahead and put the survey up, because we are 2
Sure.
minutes over, and I just want to make sure we get folks.
So I think this said, good morning, Jeff. Any threads in your research that points to consideration in creating tracks for the workforce roles? For example, technical and management roles such as cybersecurity analysts within a skill community of analytics. I remember this a few decades ago where management held applied experience in one or more roles with their skills community. The tracks help keep the talent within the functional zones and versus talent drift across other skills communities unless the employee is seeking transition into the leadership skill community.
Yeah, short answer to that is absolutely. So, one of the things that we do, because we work with organization, and one of the first steps in our work with an organization is to understand those skill expectations for those job roles. And once you have that visualized, quantified, then you can compare it with any skill expectations of any other job in the organization, whether it's a junior to mid to senior level, or whether it's a lateral movement. It's just comparing two data tables where you can see, hey, to move from job role A to job role B, we need to have additional skills in X, Y, and Z, right? So we take that data and we can prioritize what the skill development is for that natural upward trajectory or for those career changers when you're moving across two different disparate lateral movements. So absolutely. I think one thing that organizations do wrong though when they're doing this for themselves is often they're just really subjective. They think like, okay, generically, if we want to kind of move up the ranks, we need to prioritize, all these areas, but it's not always built with real data informing it. It's just kind of, I want to say it's wrong. I think a lot of the intuition is probably correct, but it helps to prioritize based on what the data is actually telling you to know to what degree do you need to learn, more skills in encryption concepts, right? Versus data privacy, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay, here's another one for Will. If employers are not hiring entry-level cyber graduates, does your data show who is fulfilling those job roles? IT support, systems administration, what would they be?
Yeah, so if the question is more about who is filling the entry level cyber responsibilities as opposed to where are those people going if not entry level cyber, um, yeah, I think it be a couple of things. Sometimes there are a few early career opportunities. I think more often than, so you might see some SOC analysts or some entry level analysts do some work in cyber. I think those are not necessarily the norm in a lot of organizations. I think it's more likely that you have mid-career people who also are responsible for some of the early career work. Um, and sometimes you do see, depending on the organization, you do see people from across other IT domains chip in. So I think it really is organization dependent. Admittedly, over recent years, we've also seen some of those early career jobs are being outsourced. So it's not that there aren't early career workers doing them; it's that they're not doing them domestically. And you might have some of those early career opportunities, are primarily showing up in other regions. Off the top of my head, I don't know exactly what the breakout looks like across those different places that they could be situated, but I suspect that it is going to be some combination of having a little bit of outsourcing, a little bit of mid-career folks also being asked to do the entry-level folks, a few early career workers in some organizations that are large enough to invest in their talent pipeline, and in some cases, it's going to be dispersed across other functions of IT.
Okay, good. One last question to both of you. What suggestions do you have for entry-level cybersecurity 2-year AS degree graduates to enter AI-driven cybersecurity careers?
I'm about finished typing a response to that, so I'll let Will go ahead and verbalize while I hit
Okay.
enter.
Well, I mean, the first thing I'd say is don't just think of there being a non-AI and an AI-enabled cyber track. I think it's just AI is a new tool that everybody's using. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to automate everybody out of existence, but it is something that you're going to need to be able to utilize. And I would say, yeah, always keep an eye on what the emerging skills are, but also don't forget about some of those foundational capabilities. So I think Jeff did a great job of articulating the value of things like critical thinking and power skills or durable skills or whatever you want to call them. I think that when I advise people on how do you think about making sure you're future proofing your skill set, I say you should think about both the stable skills and the sexy skills. The stable skills are the skills like critical thinking, their communication, their collaboration. Those have been important for a long time. They're going to continue to be important. Increasingly, though, you also have to think about those sexy skills. That's where some of those new AI capabilities come in. And I would say don't get too hung up on like what the latest model is. That's going to change. Don't get too hung up on, how you should be, utilizing whatever tool everybody's utilizing right now. That's kind of a revolving door, especially in a field that moves so fast. I'd say more important is that you build the foundational literacy in that field so that you can constantly keep up with it, whatever that latest and greatest sexy skill is. And then you can just, have that nice, firm technical foundation that you can then layer new skills on top of. So I would say don't just aim for the target that everybody is talking about today. Aim for a set of skills that's going to give you sustainable employment opportunities for decades to come.
Okay, that's great information. Thank you. And I think that's about all the questions we have. Please use the QR code for the survey. That's very important for uh, our evaluators and for our funders. So we appreciate that. This is great. I think we can go on forever on that. I've got a lot of questions, but we don't have time for it. But maybe I'll catch up with you all. I really think it's great that this information really will help guide other community colleges in their curriculum. And I'm doing a capstone class for a master's program right now. What you just went over is something I can incorporate into that course. So this is great.
Well, thank you for having us. Appreciate it.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much.